Hello. So we are starting our next unit on evolution. We just wrapped up genetics. So we're moving on to this next somewhat smaller unit on evolution and how organisms are changing over time. So let's first start with the definition. So theory of evolution is change over time for a species, not an individual. This is over many, many thousands of generations. Okay, not one or two generations, but a long period of time. You're going to see gradual changes that can lead to larger ones, and we'll get into how that occurs. But I just want to make sure it's clear that an individual is not going through evolution, right? You can never say that an individual evolves. Not a thing. Okay, individuals have beneficial or disadvantageous traits. The ones that have the good traits are going to be the ones that get passed on to the next generation, potentially changing the species once all of those are added up. Okay, but it's not an individual, and it's not one or two generations, so it's a long time. Okay, so let's first cover, now that we know the definition, is what evolution is not, and what people thought it was back before the modern theory came about. So the first guy to come up with a idea about evolution that was not correct was named Lamarck. And he thought that acquired traits could be passed on from parent to child. All right, so acquired means you get it during your lifetime. Okay, for us humans, that would be like a bodybuilder, right? Think Arnold Schwarzenegger or something like that, passing on their muscles to their kids, right? So their babies are going to come out with like six packs and like huge biceps, right? That was Lamarck's idea. It really wasn't even a theory, even though it was called that. It was more like a hypothesis because it could be easily tested. For example, there was another scientist named Weismann who actually did a study where he cut the tails off of mice. Not very nice, I know. But those mice with cut off tails had babies, and guess what? Their kids had tails, right? The little baby mice had tails because the genes were still in there, right, for tails. So there was no reason for those baby mice to not have tails, okay? So his big example is with the giraffes. All right, so he said that giraffes that had somewhat longer necks stretched them to reach the leaves of food, right? And those ones that stretched their necks then passed on their acquired traits of stretching necks to their kids. Their kids had longer necks because their parents stretched them, right? Not true. Again, that'd be like the bodybuilder passing on their muscles to their kids, okay? So that was Lamarck's really not even theory. It was more like a hypothesis, quickly disproven by another scientist named Weismann. So Darwin would describe how the giraffes have different length necks, or why some are larger and some are smaller, based on the process of natural selection. So he would explain it as some giraffes just naturally have larger necks and shorter necks just because there's variation in the species, right? There's variation in the human species. We don't look the same and have all the same genes. So the same goes for other animals in the animal kingdom, right? Or plants or fungus, whatever. So the ones that happen to have slightly larger necks are going to be able to reach more food, have more full bellies, and then be more fit to actually reproduce and pass those genes on. The ones that just happen to have larger necks, right? Those are going to be the ones that happen to also reproduce, pass their genes on to the next generation. And the ones with smaller necks might have enough food to reproduce and pass their genes on, but probably not as likely. And so the ones with smaller necks died off, didn't get to pass their genes on to the next generation. And so you naturally happen to shift to a population that gradually has longer and longer necks, okay? Versus Lamarck's idea of just stretching, passing on an acquired trait, right? Which we know is not correct. So let's get to his actual concept. So Darwin actually came up with the idea of evolution by natural selection. So natural selection is a way that evolution can take place. Remember, a change in species over time. So the actual definition for natural selection is this. So you've heard of it before, shortened to survival of the fittest. It's more complicated than that. It's actually the survival and reproduction of the fittest individuals in their specific environment, okay? So survival of the fittest doesn't describe the full idea because you could survive but never reproduce, and then your genes never get passed on to the next generation, and then the species doesn't change at all, right? Just because you survive doesn't mean that the species will survive, right? You're just one individual in that group, in that population, okay? So it's a survival and successful reproduction of an individual in that environment. Now, again, I said individual, so individuals are not going through evolution, right? We said that earlier. But individuals some have better traits, some have worse traits. The ones with better traits are going to pass it on to the next generation, which get passed on to the next generation, and those can add up for the species over time. Okay? So natural selection is just one way that evolution can occur over time. So, and I also added on here in their specific environment, right? Because some species are best fit for aquatic environments or terrestrial, right? So picture a lion, right? The lion that is reproducing and is catching a lot of food, right, is very successful in their environment, right? We would say that lion is fit, right? It's getting the most amount of food and reproducing the most, passing its genes on to the next generation, right? So that's great and all on, in the grasslands, right? But take that lion and put it in an ocean, right? All of a sudden, that lion does not become very fit anymore, right? It might be able to catch a few fish, but probably not going to last too long swimming in the open ocean, right? Probably going to die off, right? So there's that key added part of it, the species or an individual being fit for its specific environment as well, okay? So that's the main concept of what Darwin was describing in his book on the origin of species. So we talked about what is natural selection, but there's a couple things that actually need to happen in order for natural selection to actually occur within a species in a population over time. So the first is you need to have a good number of babies, a good number of individuals in your population. If you only have a few, then there's not enough for natural selection to take place. There's not enough variety within that species in order for it to actually move the species in a way that allows them to survive in the future, right? Or in that specific environment, rather. So that's overproduction. That's what we're talking about. Just lots of individuals, okay? Some species are better at that than others, right? Larger mammals only produce a small number of offspring, whereas smaller animals or plants even can produce a bunch of offspring just within one season. So the second I already mentioned was variation. So you need to have some variation in that species, right? So where does variation come from? So Darwin actually didn't know where the variation came from. That was one of his weaknesses in his book, was he didn't know where or why there was differences in a species to begin with. That came about later from another scientist who proposed the idea of there's actually changes in the DNA called mutations. Now again, most mutations are bad news, but every once in a while mutation can be good for the species. But a lot of variation is coming from mutations. And then when those variations are combined, right, through sexual reproduction, you're going to have two different individuals that have different genes that can be combined. And so then again, you produce more variation from that as well. And number three is competition or struggle for survival. So you're going to have that variation, right, with the giraffe necks. Some are going to be slightly taller, some are slightly smaller. If there's plenty of food for all the giraffes, high and low, then neck size doesn't really matter, right? And it's not going to change the species over time, okay? But if there's another species that comes through that eats all of the lower lying plants, and so now you have slightly higher plants and leaves for the giraffes to eat, the ones with smaller necks are going to die off and not be able to have enough energy to reproduce, pass their genes on to the next generation. But the larger ones will, and so those ones will pass their genes on to the next generation. Even though the smaller ones die off, the larger ones will, the longer necks will, because they were able to get that food. So there's going to be that struggle for survival there that allows the changes to kind of accumulate and change the species over time. And then finally, it was kind of mentioned just a minute ago about there being a selection. So maybe it's not a food. Maybe it's mice that blend into their background, and birds are picking off the mice that are darker colored because it's like a snowy background, right? And the birds are going to be able to pick off the darker ones because they're more easily seen, right? So nature is going to select for or against, it's called. So selecting for means they're the mice that are hidden in the snow and not being eaten, versus the ones that have darker fur, and they're going to be the ones that get picked up by birds, and they're going to be selected against. They're going to die off. Those genes are not going to show up in the next generation. Okay, so all of these things need to occur in order for natural selection to occur. Okay, so we have this other thing called artificial selection or selective breeding that humans do, all right, that we do to other organisms. All right, we've been doing this for generations, where the most simple example is with crops, right? The wild cabbage was one of the crops that wasn't too appetizing long ago. It didn't produce much of anything that you could actually eat, but over many generations of only breeding the wild cabbage that looked more and more like a vegetable that we could actually eat, eventually we got to the point where some of that wild cabbage started to look more and more like broccoli. And the wild cabbage that kind of had more white flower buds kept being reproduced, and that's where we got cauliflower from. We call it artificial selection, not natural selection, for humans, because it's not the nature that's selecting those traits, right? It's humans. We are artificial, like artificial sweetener versus natural sweeteners, right? Artificial meaning we are controlling how a species is changing over time. So it's called artificial. It's also called selective breeding. You talk about dog breeders or people who breed different types of bovine cows. They are selecting traits that they think are best, not necessarily best for the species, right? Picture a dairy cow out in the wild, right in the forest. They're not going to do too well in nature, right? We have selected them for the traits that we like. So that kind of wraps up the intro to our evolution unit and some common vocabulary you're going to hear that'll help us to understand this unit as we move forward. Okay? Until next time, have a good one.